NCAA data. See if we can build a tool that would help us improve our ability to predict the NCAA tournament. Odds on that are pretty ridiculous, but we figure, hey, if we can do better than we've done in the past, that's progress. So I've got some NCAA data here on the NCAA.com website. Decided to start with scoring offense. So what I'm going to do is come in here to Excel, and I'm going to build a new Power Query process to be able to gather the data off of this page, off of this set of pages. So just to show a sample of this, if I plug in the URL from this page, over and just copy this URL, and you'll notice if I go to, if I go over to Excel and do a Power Query, I can use the web as a data source, get external data from the web. So I'm going to plug in this URL, click OK. It's going to give me a preview of this. The navigator bar starts up, it gives me a preview of this page and shows me that there are two tables that it can find. Table 0 is where I can see the data that I'm after. This data just shows each team, the number of games played, the number of points that they've scored, and an average of points per game based on those two numbers. So I'm going to gather that data. I'm going to pick that one, but I'm going to go into the Edit menu first and try to clean up this data a little bit. One thing that I've noticed here is that this data is actually really pretty clean. It's about the way that I want it for now. It's just the rank, the team, the games, the points, and points per game. And the ranking is based on their points per game. You'll see that they're sorted ascending, and that's the way the data is laid out. There's not a whole lot that I really need to do to this data. It's kind of in the format that I'd like to be able to use it, but it only goes down to the top 50 teams. And I'd like to be able to collect all of those teams. If I go back to the website, you'll see that those teams, they're paged. It's paged out on page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. 7 pages worth of data, and that's the way the web page is structured. It's doing that so that to optimize their usage on their website, so they're not just dumping too much data all the time and trying to throttle their bandwidth usage and those kinds of things. So I need to be able to see the structure for how these URLs work. If I click on page 2, you'll notice that the URL, the only difference on there is that it adds a P2 at the end. Now, depending on how your pages are structured, you might be able to create some kind of a loop to loop through these pages or not. I tend to go back to probably more of an old-fashioned viewpoint, and I create a text file with all of the URLs in there. So it's just going to go through page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, up through page 7. And you'll notice if I go back and click on page 1, it does that in the URL. It's got a default page, but it also has an address for page 1. So I can do that either way. But I typically create a text file out of this, and I use that to iterate over all the pages. There's style differences. There are actually several different ways that we can do this in Excel. But since I've created the basic pattern for the page, I'm going to save this pattern and turn this into a function. So I'm just going to title this OFF points. I'm just going to give it a name so that I can capture this. I don't know, maybe a better name might be OFF query or points query or something like that. Gather points. A lot of different names I can use, but once I give it a name, then I can close out of this query and save the steps. And actually, one other step that I need to do to this is right now it's saved just as a query format. To turn it into a function, I need to be able to parameterize this. In other words, functions take in inputs and then return outputs based on those inputs. I'm going to create this as a function by recursively calling this query, and I'm going to use these set of links or these URLs as my input. I'm going to use this as a parameter to the query, so that it'll turn it into a function. So I recursively call this query that I've created, and instead of having it go to a specific URL every time, I'm going to replace that URL with just a generic variable name. I'm going to call it link, and in this case it's going to be a set of links. Because I've turned it into a function, I'm going to be able to feed in each link separately, and I can iterate over this function over and over and over. But you'll notice that when I'm done changing this top link or top syntax in this query, now I've got to go down and add in one at the bottom. It says that down at the bottom I get this error message. It says token in expected. Now that's just giving you an error message saying that anytime you have a let statement, usually you have a corresponding in statement. It's do some action in what context. That's roughly the way that I think about how this works. So I'm going to do it in the context of the OFF points function. So it's recursively calling this within the function now, calling this query, and it's turned it into a function. So here's my function now, and you'll see that it changes my menu. It shows me that this is a function that takes a link as text as its parameter or as its input value, and I'm going to call that good. I'm going to save this where it is. I'll close out of this this function. Can keep the changes, and you'll see that I now have in my workbook queries list, I have a function listed. Okay, now I'm going to take my text file where I've created all these URLs. I call that the OFF points URLs.txt file. It's just a list of the URLs that I want to pull from. And in this case, Excel's a little smarter than me, I guess. They've created some code to automatically parse based on certain triggers, and when it sees a colon, it tries to parse that into two columns. So I'm going to actually have to merge that back together. I'm going to highlight those two columns by hitting the Shift key and clicking each of the columns, and you want to do them in the order that you want them to preserve them in. In this case, I did column 1 and then Shift and column 2, so that it'll, when I merge the two columns, it'll merge them as column 1 first and column 2 second. Sometimes that's easy to get flipped around when you're clicking around and not thinking. So make sure you do them in the order that you want them in as you click across them. So I'm going to merge those columns. I'm going to put the colon back, or the colon back into there. So I have http:// so I've got the full URL. And I can call this, I can give this a column name. I'll just call this my URLs. Now here's my set of URLs that I'm going to iterate over. And I'm going to, let's see, I need to add this as a new column. Now I need to do something with it. So I'm going to create a custom column. And what I'm going to do with it is call the OFF points function and feed into it, oops, parenthesis, I'm going to feed into it the available columns. I'm going to feed into it the array of URLs, or the column of URLs that I've created, and close out the function. It tells me no syntax error has been detected, so I can move on. And you'll see that what that's going to generate, or what it's going to return from that function, is a set of tables. So if I click on this expand button up here at the top, it shows me that if I can either expand or aggregate that data. In this case, I want to expand it because I want to get all these data elements out onto the page. So I click OK. This gives me a preview of what's in that. You'll see that as I scroll down, it gives me the first 100. Oh, this is actually going to give me the whole thing. Hey, sometimes the preview will only give you a couple rows. In this case, it was small enough that it gave me the entire data set and showed me that it's going to pick up all 345 teams with this query now. A couple things though that I want to change on this before I actually run the whole query and return it into my Excel document is that I don't actually care what URL this came from, so I can actually go back and remove that column now. After it's run the query, it's got the data that it needs, it knows where to get it from. After it returns it, I don't need that value anymore. I also don't like the custom designation on the beginning of this. Sometimes that's good to keep track of where it came from, to keep track, especially if you're going across similar pages. I might want that naming convention, but I don't really want it in this case. So I'm going to go back and just rename the columns. Take those out, take the custom designation off of it. And in this case, actually, it probably makes more sense for me to title these with something more meaningful. So I'm going to title this as a games column. And this will be the points column. And this will be the points PPG. That works. I'm just going to retitle those. Now I've got all these steps. If I go over to my view and look at my query settings, it brings up this list of steps that I've saved as part of this process. And I can save this query and run it. I'm going to go back to the home and just click the close and load. And it's going to run through this. I can rename this query if I like. Since I already named the function, I'm just going to let this query run. I guess I should rename it. I'll do the off query. Probably ought to name that one the OFF points function, just to be clear. Usually it's good to make sure your naming conventions are easy for somebody else to follow. So I'm going to call that the OFF query, let it run. You see it's got 100 points in the preview while it loads. If I go down to the bottom, it just shows me a ... meaning that it's still running right now. And you'll see the circle is running. It says it's waiting for the NCAA.com. Sometimes these queries can take a while. It's like it's up to 200 rows loaded, 250. I'm trying to get up to 345, so I've got just another minute to wait here. And it's got all this loaded. Now if I go down to the bottom, I've got all those teams loaded and their current number of games and points per game. Typically I go back and rename my tables. In this case, when you run the query, it just picks up the query name and names your table accordingly. So probably good to make sure you rename your tables, make them something human readable. And now we've got a query. We've got a new set of data to add to our table. I'm going to rename that sheet as well, just to make sure that I can understand what's on it. I'll call it the OFF query, since that's the name of the table and the name of the query that ran. Just so I can know where to find that one on the sheets. And there's my query. There's my whole set of process to capture all that data, and we'll stop it from there.